I did probably 10 minutes of his bio, but I won't do that for you today. So there was a question though. Did you do a STM? Someone asked that.
No, I did my graduate work when I was in the parish, so it was just a PhD program.
Yeah, just a PhD. Yeah, everyone does that. All right. So why don't we get right into it? And thanks for going back over to the office. Those offices look too familiar for me. So sometimes it was a good thing when I was in there, and sometimes it was a bad thing when I went into those offices. So blessings as we hear our first on the fortresses today.
Yeah, so last night what we talked about, if you weren't able to be with us, was the idea of what is usually called in our theology the three estates. That is, three, let's say, realms of life God has established in order for human beings to live in. This is normal, it's in that sense natural because God made us to be that way. And those three estates are the family, the church, and the government. Sometimes people start in a different order, sort of like how some churches have a different ordering of the Ten Commandments than we do. And people will sometimes say church, family, and government, trying to indicate what is, most important. Obviously, eternally, membership in the church, saving faith in Jesus Christ, is the most important thing in a person's life, regardless of how his family operates or fails to operate, or how his government operates or fails to operate. The reason that we're starting today in this hour with the family is just because I think that is the locus, that's the place of greatest contention and difficulty. That's the place where I think generally, especially our young people, are challenged. It's also within the realm of the family that we're asked to make decisions about, for lack of a better word, the ideological fitness. Whether someone else's views are acceptable, we are sometimes even encouraged to kind of fight with family members over their political views or religious views, maybe at Thanksgiving or Christmas. The family is the place, I think, that has, for the longest time, it is the fortress that has sustained the most damage. So that's why we're starting there. We're also starting there for this simple reason that when Luther talks about the Ten Commandments in the Large Catechism, which I referred to last night, and I'd encourage you to go back and, if you never have before, read the Large Catechism. That is a wonderful place to go from here because they were originally designed somewhat like what I'm doing this weekend with you guys as discussions with congregation members. The Large Catechism was not written as a kind of abstract theological treatise, so it's extremely accessible to really anyone I've ever studied it with. In that Large Catechism on the Fourth Commandment, Luther talks about how the Fourth Commandment, honor your father and your mother, really connects the other two groups of commandments, usually called tables of the law. So you've got 1, 2, and 3 commandments about how we relate to God. You've got 5 through 10 commandments about how we relate to our neighbor. 4 is usually grouped, when this is portrayed visually, maybe on a Sunday school poster, with 5 through 10, so that the second table of the law is 4 through 10. Luther's insight, however, in the Large Catechism, is that if duty to God and duty to neighbor are going to be learned anywhere, it will be or it won't be from the father and the mother. That is, the family is really kind of the place where love of God and love of the neighbor flow into and out of, or fail to flow into and out of. So that when we're talking about a crisis in the fortress of the family, we're talking about a crisis also for the church and the government. I think it's fairly simple to understand how that could be. That if we have somebody who has never been taught how to pray, has never been taught to think, for instance, of going to church, he's just going to be a lot less likely than if he had been to go to church. Really kind of simple. If someone has never been taught to respect authority and understand the difference between someone holding an office and his personal views of that individual, right? So when you're about, I don't know, 9, 10, 11, you begin to realize that your parents are not infallible, maybe the way you thought when you were 5, 6, 7. And at that time, you learn, if your parents are good parents and they're raising you the right way, the difference between, I'm your father, you need to respect that, and I'm a person with my own failings and sins. If people never learn that, especially when you look at statistics of all kinds of crime, things in which the government, we said last night, really should be concerned, right? The punishment of wickedness. You see an incredible correlation between fatherlessness and the commission of crime. So that if we have someone who grows up, especially a young man, who doesn't know how to relate to male authority, he's going to have that much more trouble in life and maybe cause that much more trouble than if he had his father at home disciplining him, not infallibly, but with the kind of godly discipline that God wants us to exhibit, to display, to practice with our children so that they can grow up to be useful people, pious people. So the family we're going to look at in this first section as the link to everything else, because it's there that we find that people learn to love or not to love God, learn to love or not to love the neighbor. Now, in each of the fortresses, the reason that we set up this imagery, we said last night, is because it's a refuge. It's a place I can flee to. It's something that I can run into and find. And a lot of people who convert to Christianity, either at the time of college or maybe early adulthood, the most common time really for people to convert to anything, if they weren't raised in a Christian home, very often it is the relative functionality of Christians' lives that they notice first in modern America. Because dysfunctionality, not just in the sense that people get grumpy or hold grudges or aren't as good as they ought to be with one another or for one another, but the idea that the home is at all intact, that people pray, that the Bible is read, these very used to be basic things. I'm not sure that they are so much anymore. They seem more exceptional than normal to me, but when people find those things, they find, as it were, a whole other world. That is, a group of people functioning not according to their own choices or predilections, as we talked about last night, spurred on by various kinds of media, entertainment, news, educational media, whatever the case may be. But people ordering their lives according to the Word of God. So when we talk about a fortress, we find not only a refuge for the church, peace for the church, so that we don't have to be racked by anxiety about the future. This is also a refuge for people who are fleeing out of the destruction, especially of family life, that we find all around us. And the urgency of that, I don't think you really need to stretch very far to understand. That is, even when people grow up in loving families, let's say that they were adopted, they're still curious about where they came from biologically, even acknowledging the connection and the love that they have because of the people who adopted them. There is something that pushes on each of us about our families, about our heritage, about who we came from, and not just where we came from. And sometimes that's kind of humorous, because you realize with growing age or similarity of experience how much, generally speaking, you resemble your parent of the same sex as you. You find yourself saying things, maybe even having a voice sufficiently similar that it sounds in your ears, it kindles in you a kind of memory of someone who may not even be on this earth anymore. When you say something to your kids like, stop fidgeting with your seatbelt, we'll be there soon, and it takes you right back in the same voice to 30 years earlier when your dad said it in the same tone with the same accent that you are now. Those kinds of things are sufficiently normal and obvious that when you're talking to people who are not Christians, or let's say are not yet Christians, I think they can understand how urgent and important the family is. That's also why I am not going to start out with biblical statements about what the family is. We'll do that sort of in the middle of this section. In the first part of this second session of the whole thing, the first session of today, we're going to start out by talking about the assault on the family, thinking of each of these fortresses as a fortress under, excuse me, in some way under siege. So if there's a siege, are they bringing big war machines up against the walls and they're going to batter down the walls? Are they building ramparts so that rather than batter down the walls, they can climb over them? Are they going to try to burn down the walls if they can? How will this be done? And so in each of the sessions today, before we think about what the fortress is, we want to think as clearly as we possibly can about what is assaulting that fortress, whether of the family or of the church or of the government. When we think about the family, we're going to start just with the definition of that word, family, to which are related words like familiar and familial. And the word is usually stretched, certainly by people, let's say maybe 45 and under. Family is very often used in order to talk about their friends or people who have the same interests or do the same activities as they do. Those are their family. Your employer may even talk about you as a family, even if there are 11,000 employees nationwide or something. You're still a family dedicated to printing products or commercial egg production or who knows what. But you are, at least in the conceit of the Human Resources Department, family. And that's intended to convey whether we're talking about people that like to go rock climbing together, or people who all have kids in the same elementary school, or people who all work in commercial egg production. All of those things are trying to speak, by way of analogy, about something that is somewhere else literally true. So when we talked about last night the role of smartphones or the role of people's online lives, right, even before the advent of smartphones, and how that changes their perception of what is real or what is normal or especially what is right and true, then when you think about this way of using family that is fairly common, you realize that what's happening is we deal with mostly, really, throughout our lives in analogies. That is, you're talking to people, you're dealing with people, you are devoting time and energy to people who are not actually, or maybe we could say literally, family. What that means is that the word itself gets stretched because it's usually used as an analogy and not straightforwardly. Now, I think that depends really widely on what generation somebody is in, right? How much that word stretches. But the reason it varies widely between generations is particularly because of the impact of media on us and the way that media creates, even between, let's say, 2 people or 3 people in the same household, that is literally in the same family. Media can create enormous gulfs between us, right? So this way of thinking is extremely popular at this point, of thinking about people generationally, right? Silent generation, boomers, Gen X, it was supposed to be called Gen Y, and then it got called millennials. Then now you have Gen Z, sometimes called Zoomers, who all have to live on the internet all the time, just by virtue of existing. So those ways of thinking about generations, which obviously divide up families very neatly, okay? And even when it's not particularly accurate, I mean, somebody who is 48 years old is not a baby boomer, but may be thought of by his children as boomer and told, okay, boomer, when he says something. That kind of, at least division, if not actual hostility, it often turns into hostility between generations. means that we get associated really by virtue of the media that we grew up with and not by virtue of being blood related to each other. That is, our analogous family, the same people who grew up watching black and white westerns on TV, and the same people who grew up watching MTV on very basic cable, or the same people who grew up entirely on the internet, those people purportedly have more in common with us, greater sympathy, greater understanding, better grasp of reality, probably each generation thinks, than the family that we actually have who would go in an actual family tree. Now, this assault on just the word has been going on for a long time. Right after the Second World War, there were a variety of social theorists, largely coming from Germany, Austria, Hungary, in some cases, what would become communist countries in Eastern Europe after the Second World War, flooded into the United States and into our university system. This was called, before the most famous of them came here, named after the university from which they came in West Germany immediately after the Second World War. This was called the Frankfurt School. Names here like Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, among others, are prominent. The thing that they identified about the family as, let's just use the adjective right now, traditionally constituted, okay? We'll talk about how that really generally means biblical later on. But traditionally constituted, that the family was a source of, in their words, authoritarianism. So, what we got rid of as the Allied powers in especially Germany in the Second World War would have to likewise be expunged by a much longer and more complex social process. Also in the towns, in the villages, on the farmsteads of the UK and the United States and the other Allied powers. Why, right? You might ask yourself, why? Why? If you watch Leave It to Beaver, right, which predates the mainstreaming of Frankfurt School ideology in American thought, you watch Leave It to Beaver, is there something so evil about how the family relates to each other? Is Beaver Cleaver going to turn out to want to murder a bunch of people for irrational reasons or something? I don't think so. But the recognition there was that, actually sort of similar to what I said at the beginning of this talk, that the family is the place where people learn how to relate to authority. It's where they learn how to relate to other people, full stop, or not to. So what had to be expunged about that, what would come to be called nuclear family, right? The man, the woman, and the children God gives them, as we said last night. What needed to be expunged was the idea that that was a place of authority, or that that had value that could not be touched by other places. And it was and needed to remain and needed to be protected as stable. Now, this was not actually always the case, in the sense that the 1950s are unusual in many ways, not least in the volume of church attendance. I mean, Americans were church members in the decade of the 1950s in greater percentages than before then or since then. So there is something unusual about that decade, or if you want to think of it a little more loosely, all that time between VJ Day in 1945 and the assassination of John F. Kennedy in November 1963. That time is a very unique time in our history, and some of us lived through it, and all of us have heard plenty about it. And it makes it a little more difficult to be hopeful in our day, because we didn't come straight from a time that actually resembled ours more, which would be, if you go back and read people talking about falling rates of marriage or rising rates of divorce or falling numbers of children per marriage. The 1920s look more, in many ways, like the 2020s than they do like the 1950s. So that makes it all a little difficult to understand, because what basically all of us have known in our adult lifetimes, certainly, is decline from something that was relatively stable. That is, if you were born in 1951, you were very unlikely to grow up without both your mother and your father living in the household. And it's not that there were no exceptions. I can look at my own family tree and find exceptions to that, but exceptions are just what I say they are, right? They're not rules. They're not half the time. They're not 67% of the time. If you're born in 1981, the situation is far different. You're relatively a lot more likely to grow up without your mother and your father. Now, what does that matter, right? We can talk about all kinds of things that changed. It became legally much easier to obtain a divorce. It became legally much easier to, force alimony to be paid. All kinds of factors, and the growth of family courts and family and welfare services is enormous in the time since the 1950s. So what actually changed? I think what changed on the most basic level is that if you ask someone what is a family, it has become progressively harder for people to say. Now, that doesn't mean that you're running around wherever it is that you live and you're amazing, going up to 80-degree weather today, okay? Asking people pop quiz style on the street like you're running a late show, what is a family? And then the audience can laugh when they say, family? Or, I don't know, or someone just breaks down in tears. The point is that if I can't even say what it is, how could I want it or pursue it or see it or know it when I do see it? So there's first of all an assault just on the definition of family. That, not coincidentally, is going to go along with a redefinition of the term marriage. And long before we had debates about gay marriage or legalization of gay marriage, or even before we were talking about civil unions, we were making the definition of marriage relatively, in a legal sense, much looser than it had been, meaning marriage became much more a matter of choice. I don't mean choosing. Arranged marriage was never really very common in Western countries. But I mean getting out of marriage. That became much more thinkable, not only legally possible, but long before legal possibility, thinkable. And at one time, you would have had to go to Nevada for a certain amount of time and establish some kind of residency in order to obtain a relatively legally simple divorce, certainly without an act of your state legislature, which, believe it or not, would have been required in many states at one time. That idea that you can get out, that this marriage just isn't working for me anymore, or this isn't what I signed up for, or whatever the case may be, that is gradually going to redefine marriage really long before, decades before, anyone is seriously mooting gay marriage or civil union, something legally resembling in benefits and legal entailments, marriage, right? Even before we're talking about that, the idea of what a marriage is has become much, much looser, okay? If that's the case, and after we talk about these other two redefinitions, we'll stop for some questions. If that's the case, then we really should not be surprised by what is currently occurring very obviously in a very big way, which is the redefinition now of what man and woman are. So if God makes people to exist in families, and the family is a man and a woman and the children God gives them, then if I shape one of those things, it's sort of like taking, one ingredient out of a cake, right? You probably didn't think much about the necessity of salt in the recipe until you forgot it, and then you tasted it and it just didn't taste right. Then there are things that are a lot more obvious, that if they're missing in a cake, everyone would say right away, yeah, that's horrible. I can't believe you left it out of the cake, like sugar, or a sugar substitute, right? And then there are other things that if you just left them out of the cake, you would say this is horrifying. Similarly, with anything that God sets up, if you leave out one of the elements that he's put in there, you are going to cause havoc for everything else. So if family or marriage are up for grabs as redefinitions, then obviously in two different ways, man and woman are up for redefinition. There's one way in which man and woman are up for redefinition as the sheer fact of I'm the man in the marriage. We have no question about what biologically each of us is supposed to be doing. But since a marriage isn't, set up by God necessarily, or maybe I don't want to make the hard decisions, I don't want to exercise headship, or the woman conversely doesn't want to figure out whatever it is that submission means biblically. Okay, so go ahead, see where that goes, right? So in one sense, the redefinition of man and woman means not their biological, abolition. That's going to be the second one. But it means that we really don't know what that is, that it changes, that therefore being a man becomes something more like a performance than a discovery, okay? So I pretend to be a man, or I wear certain clothes, or grow a beard of a certain length. And if I can do that, you see how this works, if I can do that while being biologically female, then am I not just as much of a man as you are? Since all of this is a performance anyway, it's not something given. That's one redefinition of man and woman. The other is very simply that man and woman go out of existence. So my wife is always noticing this, that when, kind of big governmental or, non-governmental entities now talk about pregnancy, this will happen with like the Center for Disease Control and stuff like that. When they talk about pregnancy, they now use the circumlocution, pregnant people. And, this offends her because obviously a big part of her being a woman is that she bears children, and I do not. And, my kids think it's funny if a man tells us, we're pregnant. Now, we know what he means by that, but my kids just think that's hilarious because, of course, there's no such thing as pregnant people. There are just women who are either pregnant or not pregnant, but the only option there is woman. But the reason that they're saying that, pregnant people or people who could become pregnant, maybe in like a pharmaceuticals ad, the reason that that's happening is because that is also up for grabs. Who knows? I mean, who are you to say that that person is not a woman? Because what we're really grappling with here, in a spiritual sense, is the assertion of lies in such a bold way that we have to either call them lies or we have to submit to them. The things that we deal with these kinds of redefinitions of family or man or woman are not like someone telling a fib about where exactly he got the pack of chewing gum from that he's holding in his hand at 10 years old. Okay, he may have swiped that from his friend's backpack. He may have gotten it out of the vending machine when his mom told him not to. Whatever the case may be, he is kind of ashamed of what he's saying, and he's not so sure that he's even right in what he did. When someone who is biologically male insists that he's female, or vice versa, but male to female is much more common. When someone is doing that, what you're being dared to do, either by that person individually or by the advertisement you're seeing or whatever the case may be, you're being dared either to accept that or to do something about it because it's such an enormous lie. It would be like my saying to you, well, actually it's 75 degrees here in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and I have a cold, so I just didn't feel like getting on a plane. So sorry, that's why I'm not with you. That would be a straightforward lie, right? Because it's 18 degrees. I do have a cold, so there's that. But it's only 18 degrees. It would be, I'm daring you, and I'll turn the camera around and show you the snow outside, and then you can decide whether you're going to say, yes, it's 75 degrees there where you are, or whether you're going to call me on it. So that's where we are right now, that second kind of redefinition. The third kind, I fear we are getting into, and I've already seen rumblings of this in academia, and that is the redefinition of what it means to be a child. And by this, I don't mean age. Okay? I don't think they're going to try to say, a 12-year-old is a grown-up, so he can go to work and work full-time. That's not going to happen. The redefinition is the redefinition, for example, of what we have traditionally thought of as children's innocence, especially sexual innocence, but just innocence generally, that they are not exposed to all of the realities of adult life, that they're neither ready for, nor if they saw them or encountered them would know what to do anything with, right? So those could be things like violence, those could be things like sexualization, it could be any number of things. Children are sometimes through explicit sex education curricula in school systems, but more often, I think, through media, are exposed to every kind of strange idea. Here's a boy who dresses like a girl in this cartoon. All of these sorts of things that seem somewhat unimaginable to many of us. I don't think it's at all coincidental that is what is happening. The redefinition of childhood follows very naturally upon the idea that anything can be redefined, that there are no biological givens or naturally made hard limits to human life. A woman can be just as strong as a man, a child can have sexual desires, a family can be anything that anyone makes of it. It's all up for grabs. I want you to notice that those different kinds of redefinition are all matters not so much of force or often direct legislation. They are matters more often of bureaucratic regulation, but even more than that, of media presentation, that we are asked to rethink these things, to reimagine these things through the media, in the same way that at one time the media was, to some degree, reinforcing what the Bible says about the family, which is where we'll go next. But I want to stop for questions or comments before we go on. Anybody?
Pastor Larson put me in charge at the mic. That was his mistake. He should have known better. But for those of you who don't know me, I'm Tom Geiser. I'm a layman here at Atonement, and I'll be happy to take the mic to you if you have a question or a comment for Dr. Koontz. Anybody? All right, got one over here.
Thank you. One question I have is, how do we hang on to the meaning as the language evolves or it changes and expands? Like, do we push back and cling to the original definitions, or do we change our language?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. And it's especially difficult because people will generally think, maybe reflexively, that if something is legal, it's therefore also moral or right? So if something is legal, then it cannot really be bad. Maybe it's bad in the church, but outside the church, anything goes, right? Because this is what's normal. This is what's legal and accepted and out there. I think that certainly for the sake of the church and within our families, we need to present normal definitions. That is, the right definition. And the stakes there are not like some kind of political game. It's, am I teaching my children the truth or not, right? And if there is more complexity to that now, so if other people have a different definition of family than the one that I've been, proposing today and last night, that's fine. My children or the people in a congregation or whatever, they have time and they can have opportunity to learn that. They need to learn the truth before they learn how to handle untruth. Within the civil sphere, I think anything on which we can be active and win should be pursued. That is part of our vocation, as I'll talk about in the last lecture, part of our vocation as citizens, right? So all of that requires, I think, a degree of solidarity within our families and churches that first has to exist in order for people to be bold in, say, their workplace or their school board meeting or their town hall meeting or whatever the case may be. Because if you're just one person and you got angry and you saw stuff on the internet and then you show up at the school board meeting, if you're alone, it is very easy to silence you or to make your efforts null and void. People have to work together to achieve good things, and especially to maintain truths that the larger group has forgotten. And that requires teamwork, right? In order to maintain those things. Laura had a question, so let me take her question, and then we'll see if we have any others in the audience. Was there a responsibility of the people in the 1950s, let's say, of how they handled people that went astray? Yeah, that's also like a wonderful historical question, because somehow the 1950s did not produce something that looked like itself in most regards. Now, the exceptions exist within individual families, okay? So I know of people who are multi-generational, believe in Christians and love one another and love the Lord, and it's all great, right? But obviously societally, that's not what took place. So I think that people in any time have particular responsibilities. To go back to this idea that I gave you guys last night, if people in the 1950s had a responsibility to fight against guerrilla warfare by Satan, we have a responsibility to fight against open warfare by Satan, right? So in the 1950s, you really, truly do not have to worry that if you go to the public library, there's going to be a drag queen there reading to your children, okay? That's just not, it's simply not happening. Now, it could happen, okay? And it could happen in very, I found, unusual places. That there's a funding organization behind Drag Queen Story Hour that has in some ways targeted sort of small cities that are generally going to be more conservative and so forth. But it's a different fight than the 1950s. So I don't want to engage in just nostalgia, because there was an obvious dropping of the ball somewhere back there, such that we got all the way here, even though we had so many really blessings available to us, and people can remember them. I buried a 98-year-old man who could tell me stories about the enormous numbers of streetcars that were hired in Chicago in the 1920s when he was growing up to get all the Lutheran kids out to the picnic in this park that they were having. So all the Lutherans met each other and knew each other, and he got to see, he lived through the 1950s as an adult, and we would talk about how full the churches were, right? So those kinds of things are wonderful, and they were blessings of God. I think we have different blessings. We also have different and just maybe a great deal more open challenges. Any other questions from the audience?
Yep, we have one more over here. I'm gonna run my fat body over there to get him the mic. Here you go, Chris.
Hi, Pastor. We talked yesterday about media, and I'm curious about how portrayal of the family in media influences our society, and particularly I'm thinking about the father and the husband, and particularly like in sitcoms or advertising where he is an oaf or a buffoon, and that seems pretty widespread, and how that impacts our society.
Yeah. No, that is enormous. And I mean, I did not grow up in church. So growing up, I did everything normal, right? So I watched a lot of TV. Yeah, that's normal, I guess. And so even I noticed that, right? And I probably noticed that because my dad is this is why I only set a little bit of credence by these kind of generational things. My dad, loves classic rock and other, boomer things and John Wayne Westerns that he grew up with. But as to how he raised us, I don't, he's not the way his generation is portrayed, certainly on TV. So I'm very thankful for that. And so I noticed, because it wasn't like my dad, that the dads on TV were buffoons. They were usually stupid. They were funny. When they were redeemable characters, they were usually kind of goofy and caring. They were rarely strong. And that's a difference you can notice even if you just look at, okay, well, what are men like in Westerns, which is a genre which really kind of defines early television. And then by about the 1970s, certainly into the 1980s, it's basically just a set of reruns, right? So they tried to make an enormous blockbuster Western in the early 1980s and it just didn't take off. So you get even sometimes the difference in the genres and how genres handle people differently will show you how things have changed. And like we said last night, maybe most people, I don't know, cannot really tell the difference between what they see with their eyes and what is real. And so, that is in the nature of temptation, right, spiritually. I can't see the difference between a good thing for my life and the thing that I can see right in front of my eyes, which is actually evil, right? So Satan takes advantage of the fact that if it's in front of our eyes, it seems real, right? More real than anything else. So if the father turns into a buffoon gradually, he turns into kind of a lovable knucklehead in a sitcom, or maybe when he is straightforwardly strong, has a strong jawline or something as an actor, he's going to have to change himself. He's going to have to get more in touch with his sensitive side, or conversely, he will simply be the villain. I think often of the fact that as a little boy, and I see this now with my little boys, we don't watch TV, but we'll watch a movie every once in a while. We always watch it together, right? And so, I just showed them the first Star Wars movie the other day, right? Like a couple weeks ago. Okay, so my kids are sheltered and they're living a horrible life. They haven't seen Star Wars until now. My oldest is 11, so make your judgments about me. It doesn't bother me. But the boys were all reflexively drawn to the Empire because they're cool. They're strong and silent and they're trying to get things done. They don't reflexively like Luke Skywalker. The 4-year-old has this little Star Wars book he got from the library, and there's a little kind of personality test thing. And some of the questions, if you say yes or no, you sound like a really horrible person. But he always picks the answer that he knows when we get to the end of the test will get him to being, a soldier empire, an empire of a soldier. I'm sorry, yeah. So he wants to be on the dark side. That's where he's at because it's kind of stronger and less open and. Princess Leia doesn't run around, kind of correcting Darth Vader. So that's what they like naturally. I didn't tell them, hey guys, you need to like these guys in the black, right? I wear a lot of black professionally, so maybe that's why they like it. Who knows? But yeah, so the boys are even drawn to those kinds of things, and. My boys have probably seen more Westerns. I know they have than other kids their age because generally the men in them are more worthwhile watching. Any other questions that you guys have?
I see no hands up, so I think it's back to you.
Okay, sounds good. So let's talk in the time that remains. We maybe just a couple minutes late, so we'll take it until, 12:15, 12:20, if that's okay with you guys. I want to talk a little bit about definition and where we get definitions, because this is a way in which God's law as we have it revealed in Scripture, relates to what we would call, and what Romans 1, for instance, calls natural law. So I said earlier that when we're talking about, crises or these assaults on the family or man and woman or child, we are dealing with things that are somewhat intuitive, right? They're not extremely strange. They're things that a lot of people, and even like I said with myself, growing up, but not being a churchgoer, I intuited some of these things based on the difference between my life and what I was seeing on TV. So when we're talking about what a family is, what a man and a woman are, what a child is, we can always do two things at the same time. We can say, for example, that a family is defined by the fact that God conducts the first wedding in Eden, bringing Eve to Adam and uniting them in holy matrimony. We can also say that the only way for the human race to continue is through a man and a woman engaging in some kind of, whether the person is comfortable with the noun marriage or not, some kind of commitment to each other to raise the children they may have together. Okay. Anything besides that is either extended, okay, in the sense that Scripture will often call a grandfather or even a great-grandfather simply in a genealogy, simply a father, okay, simply a father, because of the nature of the relationship between the generations. So, but that's kind of an extended way of thinking about this, right? In addition to that, there could be analogies of family. It could be people you feel really close to, people you spend a lot of time with. That still is not the same thing as the people from whom you literally come, okay? They are your source. You are the way you are because they are the way that they are. So it's not, when we talk about family, we want to stick to both biblical revelation and, especially when we're talking to non-Christians, we want to appeal to what Paul refers to in Romans as well as 1 Corinthians as nature. Right? So Paul will say, does not nature itself teach you? Okay. So the person who's out there, doesn't believe the Bible, thinks that the story of Adam and Eve is kind of a fable, not even a nice fable. That person still has some grasp that any other way of talking about family is really an extension or an analogy of what is most basically true about the family. Similarly with man and woman, we are talking about biological givens, right? So sometimes Christians are accused of disliking science or despising science. I think I have a greater love of basic biology than many people who are not Christians at this point, because they cannot admit that biology actually matters, right? And by that, I obviously don't mean Darwinian theory about the, ascent or descent of species. I mean that the biological observable givens of human life are that we have men and women, male and female, he created them. Sometimes when Christians argue in public, even with each other, but certainly with non-Christians, they will go directly to the Bible. And I think that is totally fine among Christians. Notice that it's not quite how Paul talks to non-Christians in Acts 17. So when he's trying to get them to admit that there's only one God, he will appeal to the fact of all of these forces above them and beyond them that give them good things in life. Where does all of this come from? It logically proceeds only from one true God, whom the Athenians have been calling the unknown God. Whether Paul was successful in arguing that way or not, notice that that's how he appeals. So you have the Bible on your side in these definitions. You also always have natural law or nature itself, you might want to say, on your side as well. Also in the notion of childhood, okay? The child is not, for instance, physically, sexually mature, okay? If you go back in the past, people are 14, 15, they're starting life. That was actually kind of something that, I mean, that was part of the role of confirmation in Lutheran countries in Europe. Was your confirmation certificate was also functioned like a work pass. You're now an adult. You're setting out on a life now that you've been confirmed at the age of 14. So, we can say, oh, well, 17-year-olds could behave like adults or something. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about what an 8-year-old sees in a cartoon when she watches a cartoon. Is she ready for this? Does she need to see these sorts of things? Does she need to think about these sorts of things? And when I think about it that way, I think that you're dealing, again, with appeals that are made very directly, especially in the Gospels, about children, as well as nature itself. So this child is not ready to set out and have her own family. She doesn't need to be exposed to this. That's just logical. But I can also go into the Gospels and I can say, Jesus asserts that people need to enter the kingdom of God like a little child, because little children are strangely capable of trusting. They trust much more easily and cloak much less about themselves than we do. There is a kind of beautiful candor about children. There is also, for that reason, precisely a threat that Jesus issues to anyone who would cause one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble. Because there is something especially horrible about taking someone who trusts in Christ of any age, but especially of that kind of delicate, beautiful age, childhood, and just kind of smashing childhood upon the rocks, which is what happens when we think about things like child abuse or sexualization. Something that was divinely gifted and pure and calm has been disturbed and destroyed, okay? And the child, however old she is left to pick up the pieces. Yeah, and Laura points out in the chat that children are naturally horrified by the horrifying. That's right. They don't want to watch really scary movies, and that, that's okay. Maybe that terrifying movie isn't that good for my soul, whatever age I am, either, right? The child is in some ways more aware of that than I am. So, what we're always talking about with family, man and woman, child, are divine givens, witnessed in nature, present also in Scripture. Therefore, we can have every confidence in holding on to them and defending them, in shoring up the walls of the fortress. Because we don't have to be unsure of whether we're right or wrong, even if lots of people around us say otherwise, because God is on our side, right? God is with us. Psalm 46 talks about God this way, from which we take a mighty fortress is our God, that he is a mighty fortress and refuge. We flee to him, and he protects us. So when we think about, especially about the future, and this is where we're going to transition in the last 10 minutes or so, and then we'll take questions if you guys have them. As we talk about the future, I want you to be hopeful also about the family, despite the fact that I think the wreckage here is maybe the greatest. Okay? That there is often, for many of our families, multi-generational wreckage that takes a long time to work through individually, but also as one forms his own family. And that is okay. None of the stuff that I'm talking about, either in this hour, or in the one last night, or in the two to follow, is meant as a kind of condemnation or something. I find that relatively pointless. I don't think of myself, certainly I don't think a pastor should think of himself as a judge. I'm not here to assess penalties. We need to know what is wrong in the same way and for the same reasons that a doctor needs to know what is wrong. So we have to be honest about what the presenting symptoms are so that we can, by any means, discern what the underlying disease or diseases are. And one of the biggest diseases with the family is a refusal of definition, maybe a hard refusal on the part of people outside the church, but in my experience at least, a soft refusal on the part of people inside the church. So what do I mean by a soft refusal, and therefore what should we work toward in the future? A soft refusal could look like a variety of things. Let's take the three categories that we've been using this hour to work through them. So just start with the family. if I refuse by any variety of things, the schedule I keep, the ways that I think about what is interrupting me or what is worthwhile doing, who knows all the different ways that this could happen. But if I refuse to prioritize the family that God has given me over the other things in my life, and to think of my career, for example, as more important than that family, then I have already conceded that the family is not really what God has made it to be by virtue of saying in the fourth commandment, primarily, before all others, honor your father and your mother. If I don't prioritize that family, we're very familiar with the sense that people have that their parents didn't love them, or their parents didn't know them, or their parents neglected them, or the family was all together in the living room, but they were all actually separate on their phones or their laptops. All of that is possible. I mean, the ways in which things fall apart are always manifold, right? Evil is extremely diverse in its ways of expression. Okay, so we don't need to figure out every single way that a family could fall apart. But if I'm going forward either from this weekend or any time, and I'm thinking, I need to do this and I need to do that, and this is what I always want to do with my life. And meanwhile, this spouse and these children are right in front of me, existing, and they're not really the primary thing. Then I have already redefined family functionally, and I don't need to watch a TV show that's going to tell me to do that because I already did it. One way that I find to be immensely clarifying in thinking about that specifically is what people or whom people ask for when they're dying. So I have been at deathbeds where the person made an enormous amount of money during his life, or where he didn't, where he was recognized by many people in his community as important and upstanding. And I've buried people that I and maybe 3 other people knew their names by the time they died, because everyone else in their family, even extended, had died or moved away, was out of touch, right? So you get all these different conditions of human life, okay? People don't ask to have their W-2s put in front of them from their highest earning years, or their best investment performances on their 401ks, or any of the other things that we do spend a lot of time and energy prioritizing at other times of life. Death has a way of clarifying what is real and what is unreal, right? In the same way, clarifying what is real and what is unreal is going to apply much more probably closely going forward to men's and women's roles within the family, but probably more broadly than that in the future. Because, and I actually see this, now this is going to sound laughable to many of you, so go ahead and laugh. You're welcome to it. I am old enough that the youngest students that I have at the seminary grew up, as it were, in a technologically completely different environment. So I didn't grow up with smartphones, for example. I was out of college when smartphones came out, and I didn't even get one for 3 or 4 years after that, so didn't grow up with it, right? Many of them functionally grew up with these things. And so their sense of what is right and wrong is, in many ways, also for what is worthwhile pursuing as a man or a woman, is keener than mine was at the same age. Because I think they may actually know people that they went to high school with who are trying to become a different gender or something. And those kinds of experiences simply make you think more than you would if you hadn't had that experience. The roles that men and women play are traditionally and biblically, biologically determined. So when we say, the father is the protector and the mother is the nurturer, that is a reflection also of the biology they've been given, the strength, generally the greater height, and the desire to pursue things out in the world to bring back to the family that the father has. And the mother given a role as a nurturer of life, right? That's why Eve is named Eve, because Adam says she is the mother of all the living. Her name in Hebrew relates to the Hebrew word for life. So those things are only like small roles or limiting roles if you're going to call other things to your deathbed. So if I'm going to say on my deathbed, no, please don't bring me my wife, don't bring me my children, bring me my degrees, okay? Bring me my doctoral gown. Bring me the extended introductions people that aren't Pastor Larson made of me, okay? Right? Bring all that to me, play it back for me, tell me how important I am. If I'm going to do that, then fine. Being the father of a family is a limiting role, okay? But if I realize that that is actually the primary gift in life that we receive, under heaven, right? Besides the gift of an open heaven through faith in Christ, which is what we'll talk about in the next session, then that is more than enough, right? The measure of goodness that a person is given in family is in the way that the Father loves to give gifts, always more than enough, right? And people's not having that in their lives, or not having a childhood that has been protected, okay? A childhood where you actually were nurtured by people who were given to your full-time care and knew you better than anyone else in the world. Those things, those things are not there as just kind of nice traditional options. The reason that they are deeply satisfying for human beings is because we were created for them, right? So to return, as we finish up here, to return to how we started last night, we're talking very broadly about the difference between a life that is given by God versus the kinds of lives that sinners choose for themselves, which always leads to their own, not just destruction, but even their misery now, as they seek a way that is not His way. And when you look in that wisdom literature that we referred to last night, I mentioned the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5-7, but you can also think of Proverbs or the Psalms. You'll see a lot of discussion of ways, right? Ways, like paths you could walk in life. So it's not coincidental that when Jesus describes the way of the Christian, which we'll talk about in the next session, he talks about a straight and a narrow way. So it's well laid out, but it is hard to traverse, because the world has always, not just in the 2020s, the world has always provided a very broad and very easy way, okay? But that is a way that leads to destruction. And I think that a lot of younger people, younger than myself, indeed, have perceived these things much earlier than I did, and maybe than many of you did in life. And they are already set out upon the narrow way. So I'll stop there. We have a little bit of time for questions, and then we'll take a break before our next session.
All right, anybody else have questions? We have a hand up already. Here we go.
See what you think of this analysis. Seems to me around 1970, maybe 68 to 73, we had a perfect storm occur in our society with all the rebellions, the acceptance of divorce, abortion, homosexuality. All of that occurred or came to the surface right around those years. And as I've thought about why is that, it occurs to me that as a boomer myself, that we were the generation that went off to college. And when we came back, vacations and ultimately graduation, our parents were impressed. Oh, you're educated. We're just farmers or business people or whatever. And so they handed off to us. They backed off. They released what was our in many cases, much more broadly than now, biblical and Christian foundations for faith and morality. And we went to the secular basis for truth and so forth. And that was such a huge mistake that they started to trust us as these kids. We were teaching them. I don't know, just a thought.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think too, I think about this with something else that occurred obviously in our church around that time, which was the Battle for the Bible, which was focused on Concordia Seminary St. Louis and its faculty and their refusal to acknowledge that Scripture is inerrant. But that was a battle that actually got fought all over our churches, and it had to be fought. It is unfortunate that in many cases people couldn't see that was maybe the most grievous symptom of things that always had other symptoms. And so even just the idea that division of life between, okay, in the church you learn this, but then these are the rules for success in life, and that's really, really important, and we're very impressed with you when you obtain that success, right? What's kind of disconnected, I think, in a lot of folks' families from that biblical truth that in many ways our people were maintaining, right? But life was increasingly disconnected from church and church from life. And so it became easier and easier to separate, okay, well, we're going to kind of work in the world by the world's standards with the world's rules. And then on the other hand, we will maintain the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and thank God we did, the idea that the Bible is God's inerrant word. But the thing is, the Bible talks about lots of things that impinge really directly on daily life. Like, what's a family, what's a woman, what's a child? And if we have begun to ignore that in the actual functioning of our marriages or how we raise our children, then it's kind of like we won the battle for the Bible in the Missouri Synod, but we lost something about a bigger war that, like you said, was going on not just in our midst, but socially, nationwide.
Okay, we have another question here, Pastor.
Sorry, my name is Kirsten, and I'm a single mom, and I come from a family that is divided as far as churches go. My father claims he believes in God. My mother was a Methodist, so I was raised partially and then went away from the church. Then I came back to the church, and as the only family member of my immediate family that is a churchgoer, active in the congregation and whatnot, how do we battle those that are our immediate family that get mad at you for not wanting to be with family members over Easter service or Christmas service? How do we go against that? Because that's very, very trying. No, great question. And I think that's why when you think about the three estates or three fortresses, the way we're talking about, they're always interacting with each other. And so the reason that, like when Luther says this, he's going to start with the church is because that is the one that is always going to take priority. So, if your family says, why can't you be with us? And you're like, well, I need to go to church. Very obviously, God takes priority over man. So the family is not a solution by itself to the things that ail us, not even altogether in the church. These are kind of like interlocking things that should be functioning together. But like you said, in the case of your folks having very different religious views, that will generally, and there's statistical studies of this kind of stuff too, especially when the dad is not practicing, that it makes it that much more difficult to pass on whatever they wanted to pass on religiously to the next generation. So all of this stuff has to be talking to each other. It's not like the family by itself is going to fix everything, or the church by itself. And as I think you guys will probably agree with me when we get there, certainly not the government by itself is gonna fix everything.
One more question here.
Okay, sounds good.
Yes, Pastor. My name is Howard Balch here at Atonement. And it seems to me that the devil may be working through the networks and that they're passing more and more showing in TV game shows or sitcoms that they have, that the perversion of male and female kissing each other and doing more of the gay stuff is being forced upon us. And would you agree?
That greater openness is something that I think we all notice, and it really forces a choice on you. Am I going to keep watching this, right? So if I'm kind of harmlessly watching game shows in the 1980s on network television, and that's a different kind of a problem spiritually than a lot of the shows that I could watch today, right? So if the person is, let's say, watching TV 6, 7, 8 hours a day in 1983, what is she watching? Well, some of it is actually probably going to be morally at least questionable, but most of it is going to be, spiritually speaking, a waste or a kind of uselessness, or in the words of Ecclesiastes, a vanity. It doesn't lead to anything when you're just kind of sitting there that passively. Now, it's more like, what will you actively be led into believing and doing through what you're watching, right? And that is a very different ballgame, because it means that, I'm not saying kind of, maybe even kind of lightheartedly, hey, do you actually want to sit in your recliner 6 hours a day? Like, the weather's great, or not in my case, but, you could go outside. You could do that with your life, and now it's more like, if you keep doing this, like if you watch that again, you are going, the best maybe analogy for it is you're going to be infected by something, right? You're thinking that you can carry, spiritually speaking, you can carry hot coals next to your chest and not be burned. And that is, in Proverbs, the definition of a fool.
All right, any other questions or comments for Pastor? Any hands? All right, I don't see any more hands up right now, Pastor, so if I read my schedule right, we have till 10:45 here in Phoenix for a break, about 17 minutes from now, it looks like. And my smartphone, which I have not looked at during this whole presentation, shows it's 57 degrees currently here, so just to get you a little upset, you couldn't get out of the snow. So for everybody else, I guess we'll take a 17-minute break and meet back in here. Thank you, Pastor.
Okay, thanks, guys.
Record.